Dr. Adewale's legs, mouth, and hands were tied behind his back on a chair. He tried to open his eyes, feeling as if he had just been knocked out. The lighting appeared blurry, and it seemed he was in a dark room where the kidnapper, Mr. Okoro, had put him. A few minutes later, Mr. Okoro entered the room, his right hand carrying a gun and his left a bottle of liquor. He stared at Dr. Adewale for a while before speaking. "I'm going to open your mouth. If you shout, I will kill you," Mr. Okoro said coldly. Dr. Adewale nodded, fear evident in his eyes. Mr. Okoro removed the gag from his mouth. "Where is my son?" Dr. Adewale asked immediately, his voice trembling. "Your son is fine, but let's talk," Mr. Okoro replied. "Throughout our conversation today, I want to be addressed as Lieutenant. If you call me Okoro, you will die first. Do you understand me?" Dr. Adewale nodded again, his heart pounding. "Good," Mr. Okoro said, walking towards the rear of the room. He pulled back a curtain, revealing the missing hospital staff tied up on the floor. They looked at Dr. Adewale with pleading eyes, giving body language that they were in distress. Dr. Adewale scanned the room but couldn't find his son among them. "Where is my son, Lieutenant? Why is he not among them?" he asked, his voice breaking. "We are saving the best for last." "Don't worry, he's still alive," Mr. Okoro answered. "Also, know that you have used one of your only 2 questions. So think well before you ask the other." Dr. Adewale sighed deeply, trying to gather his thoughts. "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked. Mr. Okoro smiled grimly. "Now that's a good question. It's simple, a life for a life. Or maybe in this case, a life for some lives. Now I'd give you that opportunity today to choose the life that would be saved and the one that would die today." Mr. Okoro pointed to the kidnapped, tied-up people. Moments later, another man in a mask carried Dr. Adewale's son into the room. The boy was unconscious, and he laid him on the floor. "Now I give you the power to choose between life and death. Make no mistake, if you choose your son's life, every one of your 5 staff members will die. Now choose." Dr. Adewale was dumbfounded. He couldn't utter a word. He just stared in silence. After a few minutes, Mr. Okoro said, "So you are not ready to choose, right? Okay, I will count to 3. If you don't select anyone, that means you have automatically forfeited your son's life for them." He pointed the gun at Dr. Adewale's son. Dr. Adewale began panting hard and fast. "Please don't do this," he begged. Mr. Okoro started counting. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, Dr. Adewale shouted, "I choose my son. I choose my son. Why would you make me do this?" He cried hard and heavy. "Why?" The tied-up people's eyes looked like they would pop out of their sockets. "So you mean you chose your son's life over the lives of your 5 staff members? You mean his life is more important than theirs?" Mr. Okoro said, getting closer and pointing the gun at Dr. Adewale. Then he suddenly burst into laughter. "You did right. You did excellent. You did what a father would do. Now I am sure you understand my situation and my revenge. A man's flesh and blood are worth 1,000 lives. It doesn't matter the race or ethnicity. Now you understand my revenge." Mr. Okoro sat on the floor, looking kind of sober. "The name of my son that you killed is Isaiah. I married late in life, and his mother had childbirth issues. But because of how much I loved her, I was ready to live with her without a child. Then suddenly, somehow, she conceived miraculously." Mr. Okoro continued, his voice filled with emotion. "Isaiah was our miracle. He was everything to us. But when he fell ill, and your hospital refused to treat him because I couldn't pay, he died in my arms. My wife's death was in vain. I was left with nothing but my grief and anger." Dr. Adewale listened, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Lieutenant. I can't imagine the pain you've been through. Mr. Okoro looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of rage and sadness. Sorry won't bring them back. But making you suffer, making you understand my pain, that's the only thing that gives me some peace. Mr. Okoro continued, his voice filled with emotion. Then suddenly, somehow, she conceived miraculously. Our lives changed. I was about to become a father with the woman of my dreams. Nothing else mattered. Her childbirth process was so excruciating, but she was lucky to give birth to my baby boy. I held him in my hands, and I knew the word father is a substitute for blessing. Shortly after my wife was delivered of our son, she entered into shock and died. That was when I understood that joy and sadness could encapsulate a moment. Okoro paused and looked at the kidnapped people. This time his eyes were teary. I trained my son in my old age, but it felt so easy because he was the total replica of his mother. Whenever I looked at him, I saw her face. Seeing his face was a factor in why I couldn't marry again because I knew I loved her so much. Then one night, on my way with him from an amusement park, I got robbed and beaten. While my son was crying for me, saying, "Papa, Papa," one of them bounced on him and began hitting the bottom of the gun on him. My son passed out immediately. This time, Okoro started crying profusely. I managed to move my injured body and carried my son in my hands. The robbers had already eloped with the car. Somehow, a stranger stopped and gave me a lift to your hospital. Before he stopped, no car waited at all because that part was known to be dangerous at night. This stranger that picked us up gave my son a chance at survival. Then we entered your hospital. Okoro paused, looking into Dr. Adewole's eyes. The other man working with Okoro came to hold his hands. My son entered your hospital a living being and came out dead. And why? Because I didn't have money to deposit. Even after explaining how I was robbed, this time, tears began to flow from Dr. Adewole's eyes. Okoro continued, these so-called nurses who were supposed to have empathy on me were the ones giving me attitude. This other one was even gisting, he said, pointing at them. Is that the oath of honor you swore? You turned an old man into a fatherless one, and you must pay for it. When my son died, I lost myself and drank myself away. I attempted suicide a couple of times. Then it occurred to me that killing myself was pointless if I didn't teach you a lesson. I understand money is important, but so is life. A man's life should always be a priority. He continued, I have trained more than a dozen of other people's children through school via scholarships. But I couldn't save my son. Now you understand why I must eliminate you all. He stood up and loaded his gun. Dr. Adewole, too weak to speak, finally found his voice. I understand. I understand why you must take a life. But please, let it be my life for theirs. Let it be my life for my son. Don't let the child suffer for the sins of the father. Mr. Okoro smiled. Your son and everyone's life here could never bring my son back to me, but a debt is a debt. He loaded the gun with bullets. Now let's end all this. He pointed the gun at Dr. Adewole's head. Say your last prayers. Dr. Adewole looked into Okoro's eyes, tears streaming down his face. I forgive you. I forgive you for what you are about to do, and I am sorry for your son. Then a voice sounded from behind. Okoro, end this. It was the voice of the man with him. End this and let's move from here. Okoro just stood still, looking into Dr. Adewole's eyes while Dr. Adewole looked back into his. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed. Hours later, Dr. Adewole woke up to find his son shaking him, saying, Daddy, Daddy. He also saw the other kidnapped staff members, all loosened up. What happened? He exclaimed. Well, Okoro shot up at the roof and knocked you unconscious. Then he came to us and said, when your son wakes up, he will free you all. Then he covered our mouths back up and left. Adewole started crying as he held his son in his arms. Moments later the police came to the location with his private investigator, and they turned the environment to a crime scene. The police then started interrogating every one of them to confirm what happened. Okoro had gone with no trace. Weeks later, Dr. Adewale was back to his work as news had spread about what happened. While sitting in front of his computer, he suddenly received a notification of an email from a strange address. As he opened it, it was from a strange address. He then read it. I penetrated into your life because I was consumed by revenge. I studied you online and offline. It took me about 4 years to get close to you and act like an illiterate. And at the height of my victory where I could have taken you out, you looked into my eyes and said those words, I forgive you. I don't think I could ever recover from that. If you could forgive me for almost ending your life, why couldn't I do the same? You suddenly reminded me of how sweet my wife was and what she would have wanted me to do. As you see this email, I want you to know I am in a place where I cannot be found. But I also want you to know you don't ever have to look over your shoulders anymore. I forgive you for my son's death. As Dr. Adewale looked at the email, his mouth whispered, thank you. He then closed his system and went to meet his family in the sitting room. He then told his wife of what happened. What do we do now about our reputable St. Mary's Hospital? He asked her. She responded, we rebuild. We rebuild together side by side. Thank you for watching this so far. The end.